the meeting will come to order. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Kennedy. Alderman Boyd.
Here.
Alderwoman Davis.
Present.
Alderman Kotar. Alderman Ogilvy.
Here.
Alderwoman Boyd. Alderman Bosley.
Here.
Alderman Odenberg. Chairman Rhodey.
Present.
5 present, you have quorum.
All right, we have a board builder here today, but we're waiting on some printing exhibits. Are we still waiting on those? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, we're waiting on some exhibits to be printed, copied on that. And so in the interim, we'll go ahead and have a presentation from our Gerard.
It's 2 of them.
Oh, there's 2 each. Okay. Go ahead, Gerard, proceed.
Thank you, Alderman Rhodey, HUD's committee. As you remember from my last presentation, we focused on the revenue side of the budget. Today we'll talk about the expense side of the budget. And also I want to remind you that we have 2 sets of documents. The smaller document is from the budget documents. The larger documents, the legal size documents, are from the CAFR. And as you may remember in our last presentation, I talked about the importance of looking at the CAFR. So, stepping back, as we talked about revenue in our my last presentation, we separated out the general fund, which the Board of Aldermen, ENA, has complete control of the allocation, versus special and enterprise funds that are allocated by either state statute, local ordinance, where the board does not have control of those funds. And so in a financial when the budget is financially constrained, it puts an enormous amount of stress on the general fund, which basically is the portion of the budget that we control. Special funds cannot be reallocated in times of trouble. So that is kind of the foundation I just want you to think about. Now, looking at the budget summary, which breaks out how the general fund and special funds are allocated to departments. If you think about our budget process, we start with the revenue side and we allocate or we predict how much revenue will be, and then we plug in the expenses. So as we talked about in my last presentation, for the last 10 years, revenues have been flat. Growth rates have been 2% or less in every category of revenue, which means our revenue over the last decade has not kept up with inflation, which has put enormous pressure on the expense side. Obviously, we zero out our budget, so we do not deficit spend, so we cannot spend more than we actually make in revenue. What that has done is put pressure on our budget. So our expense side has been flat over the last decade, while obviously cost of inflation, cost of doing business went up, and that's put enormous pressure on our budget. And as you'll see from a few of the exhibits, that's forced us to basically shrink the size of government. So a couple points I want to point out on the allocation of revenue through the budget or through departments. First, if you think about social services, pretty much, all social services are paid for by special funds. So if you think about SLATE, services like that, if you think about the entire Department of Health and Hospitals, none of those expenses come out of the general fund. They come out of special funds. So that would be either state or federal allocations that we have little control over, as well as specialized taxes. As you know, the largest percentage of the budget is public safety. So that's $300 million out of a $500 million general fund. So that is obviously the biggest strain on the budget is public safety. But it's important to think about that Health and Human Services, which is, you can argue, directly related to public safety, is outside of the general fund budget. So if there are federal cuts or there are state cuts, those departments will be cut without our control. Second point I'd like to point out is that we talk about economic development. With the exception of a small portion of the Planning and Urban Design Department, all of economic development is outside of the general fund. So SLDC is self-funded, is not in the budget. The Convention Bureau, which is the marketing agency for the city, is financed by special funds. So again, not having the ability to control those funds puts us at a disadvantage when you think about funding economic development. Now, I want to turn to the, it's called Table 18. It's one of the legal size handouts. This is a total of employees by function area for the city of St. Louis going back from 2008, and this is out of the CAFR, and as you may remember from my last presentation, I really encouraged everyone to really start looking at the CAFR in detail because there's a lot of good information there. Yes, ma'am.
For the public, would you explain what CAFR is?
Okay, so the CAFR is the annual financial document that is produced by the controller. It are the financial results of the city. It is how the city is judged. So our credit rating is largely determined by the CAFR. A big difference between the CAFR and the budget is a cash-based document. The CAFR is an accrual-based accounting document. So that's why the CAFR and the budget are different in some of their results, because you have an accrual-based system versus a cash-based system. But the CAFR is the results. So if you think about it, the budget is the plan for the city, what we're going to do, what we propose to do. The CAFR is what you did do. Those are the results. That's how you're judged. And also in the CAFR, there are a lot of what I call activity reports. This is one of them, where not related to the financial results of the city, they give you background information. So this document in the CAFR walks you through the head count for the entire city over the last 10 years. And as you can see, with the exception of public service, every department today is smaller than it was in 2008. The city, as of fiscal year 17, we are down 590 employees. So obviously, the impact of budget cuts really ties back to the size of government, because our biggest expense are people, right? And so if we have to cut back in different departments, that ties back to a personnel reduction, which then could drive lower city services. The second document I want to point out, also from the CAFR, and this is actually one of my favorite documents, it's an operating indicator report also produced by the controller, and it basically tries to ascertain the activity of government over the decade. So, for example, it details the number of vacant lots cut every year. And that's under parks and forestry. See, vacant lots cut every year. Vacant building grass cut every year. And what you can see is that in 2008, numbers were a lot higher. As we went into the recession, obviously those numbers drop off due to budget cuts. And for a lot of categories, they have not recovered to 2008 levels. And so when you think about the implications of cuts or departments, you see it in this report. So for example, just jumping down to airport, I can look at the number of passengers that flow through Lambert Airport. I see an enormous drop-off 2008 to 2009. Obviously, we entered the recession. Another drop-off in 2010, and then it started ticking back up. This is a great report to really get a sense of activity in the city. The number of fire suppression calls, the number of CSB calls, the number of the size of waste, as far as how much of tonnage that we're putting in landfills. And so when you compare this with the job totals, with the level of funding different departments, or the flat level of funding, you get a sense of activity. Now, is this the answer to every question? No, but it's a start to see what's happening in those departments.
Very interesting.
But in short, if you think about the budget, revenue, or excuse me, I've said to many of you, we don't, from the budget standpoint, we don't have an expense problem. We have a revenue problem, right? And you see that on the backside, in that when we do our budget, when we start with revenue, the plug is expenses, right? And so there are a lot of departments that obviously need more funding or need to be automated, that costs upfront money that we don't have. And so it's the chicken or the egg. We want our departments to be more efficient, but we don't have the upfront money because we don't have the growth in revenue. Remember, all our revenue sources are growing at 2% annualized or less. If you use historic rate of inflation of 2%, at best we're breaking even. Realistically, we're falling behind. And so the results of that, you see that on the expense side. So I'll open it up for questions.
Before we do that, just make a comment. Gerard and I obviously talk a lot off of, outside the committee hearings, and he probably told me not to explain it in this way because he thought it was probably politically incorrect, but I'm going to do it anyway. I like to think of the city budget as almost like a personal budget if it was like your home, and you're sitting there and you have certain things that you're obligated to do just to maintain your current level of lifestyle. You know, you got to go ahead and you got to make sure you pay the rent or the mortgage. You need to pay your car insurance, you know, if your roof develops. So those are your kind of just what you need to take care of yourself. And then the goal at some point would be to go ahead and take some money and stick it away for retirement so that when you're done working, you have some money. And then, you know, most of us, I think, have something, you know, some higher calling that we have a certain social obligation to do something for charity. And of course, this is where Gerard and I get kind of crossways. We both agree that when the city does something like human services, it's, you know, it's not charity, it's a moral requirement of government. But if you kind of think of government as breaking things down in three different categories, one would be human services, what we're doing for people who can't take care of themselves. Then what we do is we have our basic services that we do for people that we, you know, your average citizen educating their children, you know, cutting the grass in the park, maintaining the streets, all the types of things that we do for everybody. And then we should have another bucket of money that would be, in essence, our retirement money, and that would be money that we might, instead of investing in a 401k if we were, or a 457 if you're here in the city, instead of doing that, it's the money that we invest for the city's future, which is our growth funds. And the problem with all of this stuff is, you know, when you're investing in growth, and all we're doing with growth is, in essence, giving away money that we haven't received in the form of tax abatement or TIF. It's kind of like going out and buying a house on a credit card. You know, a credit card has high interest rates, and you go out with your credit card and you start spending things on your credit card, and you bought your whole house on your credit card, you're going to have a problem. You know, it's much better to go ahead and buy a house on a mortgage that's going to have a lower interest rate and very predictable. When you're going ahead and you're buying something on the IFCOM, you're going to overpay for it. You know, and it's like buying things with a credit card. So when we don't have money to do economic development, real money, you know, we're in essence probably overpaying in a number of ways. I think one of the successes of Cortex has been that we actually had people from outside, you know, the city, and they came in with money and they did a lot of site assemblage work. So we actually own kind of critical properties. We still needed all the economic incentives and had to reconfigure it. But I tell you, it is, you know, when you're buying, when you're in a situation when you can't pay for cash, you're going to overpay in a variety of different areas. And I think we're not too much different than other cities in that most of the things that I would call as an individual charity, I as a policymaker would call moral responsibility of government. Those things, at least on most local levels, are much of that is done on a pass-through basis coming from, you know, usually the federal government, sometimes the state, although we add some of our own money. And I think understanding how much that is something we're hoping to be able to do a little bit better going forward. But that's kind of how I kind of think of the budget. And obviously, the better we can take care of ourselves, the more money, hopefully, that we can go ahead and spend on taking care of some of the less fortunate people. One of the things that's happening in other parts of the country is local governments have been growing, and they are San Francisco as an example, I think the ratio of job growth to new housing out there has been about 4 or 5 jobs to every new house. Don't quote me on that number.
They
but
can't keep up with the growth in jobs are outgrowing the production of houses.
And so you have, and jobs, of course, produce a lot more income for local governments than residents do, and residents typically create expenses as opposed to generate revenue. But what you have then, because of the growth, is the opportunity to transfer wealth. You can always tax growth and provide additional services. But if you don't have growth, it's kind of like trying to squeeze money out of a turnip. There's just, or squeeze blood out of a turnip, I guess is the expression. But in any event, that's wanted to give you a little bit of our insight, or my insight anyway. And what I thought was we'd spend a minute or two going through and giving everybody a chance to ask questions. I believe, where's my list at? I don't know, I misplaced it again. Oh, here it is. Alderman Boyd.
Sure, thank you. Good morning. This is a great tool. I mean, I like data. I like making decisions based on data. I was wondering, could I get the table 18 and 19 in an Excel spreadsheet?
Yes, I'll reach out to the comptroller.
Okay. And you made a comment about health,
Yes.
Health and hospitals, and that it doesn't come out the general revenue?
Correct.
So where do we get?
A lot of that would be state and federal Medicaid.
All of it?
Yeah. State grants, state and federal programs, Medicaid reimbursements.
I had no idea.
Yeah, even the jails we get the money from, it's reimbursed.
Right. So the jail, for example, it costs about $100 or so to take care of a prisoner per day. The state reimburses us approximately $20 a day, so net we're out $80.
Yeah, that's what we got to fight about.
They can allocate, I believe, 40, I think they can go up to, and
I think
state,
it's like 43 or something like
Right.
that.
But
So
the
we got
ref-
to fight for our money.
and the state refuses to up the amount of the reimbursement. I know that's something that Tom Shepard, the president's office, has been working on since I started a year and a half ago.
Okay. Good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alderwoman Davis.
I thank you very much for this, because what you've done is you've condensed this from the 5 books that we get. This is a lot clearer, okay? And it also allows us to be able to explain things in a more concise way when we're talking about this. And one of the things that you highlighted is that people don't understand that the city does not have the money to put into these programs that definitely need to be funded, there's no doubt about it, but we just don't have the money. And our revenue generating process does not exist. So until we really work on that, and I'm like a broken recorder, I just talk about it all the time, because I do believe that we can earn money. I think we just need to look at it different. Government is not what it used to be. People don't want to pay taxes. Even those who can afford to pay it, they don't want to pay it. So you've got to create other ways to sustain your city, and hopefully we'll get there. But I really want to thank you for this, and I do like the opportunity for us having this service available.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Alderman Kodar asked to be excused, as did Alderman Kennedy. Alderman Ogilvy.
No questions today. Thank you.
Wow.
Alderman Bosley.
Thank you. So I appreciate the presentation. Also, I appreciate Chairman Rhodey for making sure that we are having nice educational sessions before our HUD's meeting, because there's a lot of information I think that we can get from working together. So I can appreciate that. My question is maybe, well, of course it's not on paper, but I know we just talked about the city, most, I guess, departments working at like a 2% gross income or increased rate per year, and that seems to be in line with inflation. For us to get ahead, forward thinking, let's say in the future, would you say there are any analysis that have been made that maybe can give us a projected idea of where we need to be so we can get ahead of these costs? Maybe if we need to increase our department gross value to maybe 4% or 5%?
Well, the way I would look at it is I've thought about that. I've been asked that question. One of the complications of our situation is that, people think of us as just a city, and we're actually a city and a county. So we bear the cost of both county functions and city functions. One of the things that I would like to do, I've not had the opportunity to do it yet, is basically think about kind of government costs per citizen and comparing it to the county. So if you think about St. Louis County, so St. Louis County's general fund and special fund budget is basically the same as ours. They're roughly $700 million, right? And so, but that's just the county function. To really do a fair comparison, you would have to take the municipalities' budgets, combine it with the county's budget, and then do an allocate, basically a per capita revenue, and then say, okay, at least let's try to match what the citizen in the county gets, right? But you can already see that if our budget is basically the same as the county, right? And that's not even counting reserves, which is a whole separate conversation. The county combined, at least in their last CAFR, if you count their special funds and their general funds, they basically have $700 million in cash. Most of that is reserves and special funds, but their general fund has over $100 million balance, right? I think as of our last CAFR, our general fund balance was around 15 million. So 15 million versus 100 million. So you factor that in, that's enormous. But to do just a fair comparison, and that's not to say that what the county does with the municipalities is better or worse or where it should be, but just to even say, okay, just to be comparable with the county, that's kind of where I would start. And then you would have to then dig in and say, okay, realistically, our expenses probably should be higher because we have a population that is poor. So they're going to need more help, right? I mean, you don't need a lot of social services in Ladue, right? Or Clayton or West County, right? You need them more in North County, right? The county gets to spread that cost over the entire county, where ours is concentrated. And so, so realistically, even comparing us to the county, once you got to that point, I would say, okay, our costs are going to be higher because our social services are going to be higher. And I experienced this in my work in Los Angeles County. Our social services costs were much higher than Orange County or even San Francisco, to the point that in LA County, we managed our own hospital system. We had owned and operated 7 hospitals just to cut the cost of indigent care. Because if we got to pay that cost anyway, if someone shows up at a hospital, you got to take care of them. So it was cheaper for us to do it ourselves than to have a private hospital and have to reimburse them. And so, long-winded answer, I've thought that through. That's what I would probably have to do, and I would start there and then start digging in deeper to say, okay, we need more money in health services. We need more money in economic development. We need money in more home repair, right? Home repair, our home repair program, right? That's going to be much bigger in the city than in most parts of the county. But that is something I've looked at. It's just an enormous task to pull together that type of data and then break it out by population.
Understood. I would think it'd be very time-consuming. Certainly can appreciate the work that has been done, though.
But that is something I'm looking at doing.
Thank you. Yeah, that's pretty dope. I have no further questions, though. Thank you.
Okay. Professor, thanks as always. We appreciate that. We'll now take up our single board bill for today. My apologies again for everybody for this confusion. We have been having considerable amount of confusion with regard to the calendar. Alderwoman,
Yes. Of the clean one or the
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. You have in front of you Board Bill 188, which are creating standards for new construction in the Tower Grove East neighborhood. We undertook a pretty robust community engagement process and have been through the Planning Commission and Preservation Board, and now the standards are before you. I have Dan Krasnoff with Cultural Resources here and a representative from the Tower Grove East Neighborhood Association, and we're all happy to take questions.
Alderwoman, for the benefit of everyone, I presume, was this done in-house, or was this did you contract with someone to help you establish these?
Cultural Resources worked with the neighborhood and I to do this. But yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there was no outside law firm or consulting agency
Okay.
involved.
Mr. Krasnoff, you could step up for a second if you could. I presume that was is that something that your group did then, is that right?
Well, yes, this was a community-based effort, so the desire to do this came out of the neighborhood, but we see our role as assisting in such activities, and of course we have to evaluate whether we think what's being done is appropriate from a policy perspective, but Tower Grove East already has 3 National Register districts within its boundaries, and it's a neighborhood that's seen some new development, some of it good, some of it maybe not so good in terms of its design, and so there was a strong desire on the part of the community to have more input into the design of new construction, and we were happy to assist them in the creation of the district to make that possible.
Dan, how much time, I mean, just man-hours wise, we've, for the sake of the committee, Dan and I have worked on a number of things in his prior life. Just if we wanted to replicate this in other parts of town, was this like a huge undertaking for your staff, or?
It's something that we have sufficient staffing to, you know, if there were 5 of these proposed at one time, I think we'd be snowed under. But we certainly have sufficient staffing. The last local historic district that was created in the city was created in the mid-2000s, and that's the McKinley Heights Historic District. So at the rate we're going, at about 1 new local historic district every 10 years, we're staffed to be able to accommodate those neighborhoods and those elected officials who want to pursue such a thing.
From the standpoint of, you know, for background, Dan was the person at Park Central who ushered in the first of the farm-based codes that we've had in the city in the Central West End. I presume that this is not nearly as complicated or intensive effort-wise as that would be, or?
Absolutely. This is far less prescriptive on the new development. It's really designed to, I would say, if I had to characterize it, the form-based code is designed to ensure a certain kind of development happens, and this is designed to put, so that's sort of going for trying to achieve sort of best practices in urban design, and not necessarily, there is a historic component to it, but it's not really based on compatibility with the historic context. This is designed more as a minimal kind of standard for new construction to ensure basic compatibility with the National Register districts that make up this neighborhood, is how I guess I would conceptualize it. But it's far less effort than is required for a form-based code. We could not do a form-based code of the style that was done in Forest Park Southeast or Central West End in-house with our staff at this point, in my opinion.
And if I could add, Mr. Chairman, the neighborhood themselves did quite a bit of the work in drafting, looking at examples from other areas in the city, and then having Cultural Resources review their work. So we were really grateful for the time that they spent on it.
That's absolutely true. I mean, this was, the first time I heard about this, the neighborhood had already been meeting about this and had a committee, and were sort of working on it, and then they brought us in, and they did, on the standards, they definitely did a lot of the heavy lifting, and we served as kind of a sounding board and advised them. A lot of the elements in the petition we kind of put together, but the standards, they were the composers of the standards, and we advised them along the way.
I'm trying to think, when we did the West End one, we actually had, the form-based code for the West End, we had a kind of morphed the two, we kept the two things separate, but we had the form-based code actually had to be tweaked, I guess, to honor or respect the existing historic district, didn't we? Or one or
We
the other,
did.
one or the other got tweaked, didn't it?
We did. I mean, if you look at it, the West Pine Laclede National Register District, actually in character is not necessarily that different in a lot of places. I mean, that only goes, getting into the weeds here, that only goes from Taylor to Sarah. So there were parts of the district, there were parts of the form-based district in the CWE that were not in a National
But I
Register
mean,
district.
Yeah, but I mean, we had to just,
Absolutely.
some of the heights and everything else to conform
Absolutely.
to the,
Yep.
yeah, I kind of remember that now. Okay, thank you. It's just, as you know, I'm a big believer in planning and think that, and I think a number of the aldermen would agree that they would like to have more resources devoted to planning, and to the extent that we can find that, that'd be great. Alderman Boyd, do you have any questions?
Sure, not a whole lot. I'm just scanning through, and on page 20, it talks about the sidewalk on the street is city property. Is that true? Even though it says the responsibility is of property owners?
That's my understanding.
I believe that's true. Frankly, to a certain extent, that just depends on where your property line is. For example, sometimes it's easy to assume that a property line is the sidewalk, but sometimes the property line is actually 5 to 10 feet in from the sidewalk when there's a front yard. But typically, the sidewalk is on the public right-of-way.
Okay. The other only question I have is, it's about the Tower Grove East Subcommittee. So putting it in the ordinance, does that cement the composition of that committee? Is that why we need it in the ordinance? Spelled out as far as the positions and all of that?
Where are you?
I'm on page 23, and I see there's an amendment that's forthcoming as well that relates to that.
Most sections of the original draft of the ordinance gave a role for the neighborhood association, neighborhood organization in the approval process, which is not appropriate. From the earliest stages of the drafting, we advised the neighborhood folks that that's not something you can put into law. Unfortunately, there was a clerical mistake on my office's part, and when we initially sent this in to Mr. Ghali and the staff at the Board of Aldermen, we sent the wrong version. So that version got introduced, and that's why there's the committee substitute.
There's an amendment, but I'm looking and it looks like the amendment should start on page 21 or 23 and it lists 21.
Yeah, so the substitute legislation removed that role for the committee. We work regularly with neighborhood organizations and associations in the work we do, and we see them as partners in what we do. But at the end of the day, the legal authority to execute laws is in the government, not in the citizenry or private 501c3 type organizations.
Right, I'm just curious, if we put this in the board bill, the composition of the board, so for example, it says the committee is a 7-member board appointed by Tower Grove East. What if Tower Grove wanted to expand to a 9-member board or 5-member board? Could someone later say, hey, well, the law says the board should only be made of 7 people, and then you had 9 people, and because of that one vote, it had been 7, I could have gotten approved by the board, but since you raised it to 9, I missed it by 1. That sounds like mumbo jumbo. Did that make sense?
Are you talking about 400.3 Tower Grove East Subcommittee?
Yes.
That's in the version that I think we're executing. That section is stricken from the ordinance.
Oh, you're taking it out?
The line, there should be lines through that section?
Oh, okay. Okay, then that,
Yeah, I can walk briefly through some of this.
Let's make sure that everybody
Wait a
has
minute,
what.
yeah, because
And I apologize.
there are no lines through this, is
I
here.
don't have strike-throughs on mine either, and nothing was printed when I got here this morning. I literally just
Yeah.
put, this just
I
got
see
put
a,
in my hand,
I
so
see
maybe.
a lot of grammatical errors in here.
Can I pass out, I have a version with the strike-throughs. I'm happy to.
No, that's okay, you can keep that up there, because that won't help us.
But we have worked with the city councilor's office and the clerk of the board to remove any sections of this that refer to the Tower Grove East committee. And if any of the sections are remaining, then that's an oversight, because the idea was to remove all references to that committee from the ordinance.
There is a version of the bill that you should have before you, so I apologize, you do not. But if you look at the amendments, it indicates where the changes are. There are 3 amendments.
I guess,
well,
We just went through this the other day, not having the right stuff in front of us. Let's see.
I apologize again, it wasn't ready when I got here until just
It's not
before I
your, this is
presented.
not your fault. Not your fault.
okay.
Okay, so,
So does this represent
Well,
all the strike-throughs?
we'll be a little informal here, and we'll let you go through the resolution, the amendments one at a time, and then we'll circle back and get them properly before us. But just for ease of discussion, why don't we go ahead
that takes
and
care of that.
take us through each of these amendments. So what you're saying is on page 23 up at the top, Tower Grove East.
Actually, the first part that should be removed is
Page 21.
page 21. Yes. So Article 4 is a section on the review process on page 21 of 26.
Okay.
And it says 400.1 application process. The first paragraph there starts with the word property and goes through the word community. That remains in the ordinance, because that was just a general kind of statement about the review process and the purpose for the review process. However, the next paragraph, which is the rest of section 400.1, is struck through from the word applicants wanting a building permit will be notified through the word board on the next, at the top of the next page.
Top of page 22.
Okay.
Okay.
So that section that's struck says applicants wanting a building permit will be notified that a local historic district exists and be referred to the Tower Grove East Neighborhood Association Subcommittee for review and recommendation at the next regularly scheduled Tower Grove East Neighborhood Association Board meeting currently held on the first Wednesday of the month. The Tower Grove East Neighborhood Association Subcommittee reviews and votes on this information of their recommendation based on the standards written letter to Preservation Board. However, that section that references the Tower Grove East Neighborhood Association is stricken from the final version of the board bill.
Okay, so that should not be in here.
That should
Okay.
not be in there.
Okay. And then, oh, sorry, I'm just talking.
So the next section is page 23. Well, actually, no, the next section is 400.3,
Right.
where it says Tower Grove East Subcommittee. That entire section is stricken. So that says the committee is a 7-member board appointed by the Tower Grove East Neighborhood Association in charge with reviewing and recommending new construction projects to the city for permits. Members serve as unpaid volunteers for staggered 3-year terms and can only serve 2 terms. All members must be TGE residents. A committee shall consist of the following, and then it lists sort of the members. And anyway, that entire section is stricken since there's really no role for the city to be validating or, endorsing, or, I mean, it's up to the Tower Grove East Neighborhood Association how they want to comport themselves and how they want to organize themselves. And David Rogers is here from that organization, if
Okay.
the committee would like to hear from him. So that's the Second Amendment.
Okay.
And then the final amendment, or final two or so, is section 500.2 is removed. That states, at minimum, these standards will be reviewed on an annual basis by the Tower Grove East Subcommittee. Any individual entity wishing to provide comments to the Tower Grove East Subcommittee for consideration during this annual review must be submitted to the Tower Grove East Subcommittee in writing. The Tower Grove East Subcommittee will review all comments and by a majority vote make a recommendation of change to the board. The Tower Grove East Neighborhood Association will vote on adoption of any proposed changes to the standards. We welcome neighborhood input where we have historic districts and are happy to work with members of the Board of Aldermen and those neighborhood folks on any changes that they are concerned about that they might want to see to their to this legislation. However, there's no reason for that to be in this board bill. Those organizations are freestanding organizations and are have the ability to petition, not with a small p, the government for changes to laws as they see fit. And then the final amendment is the rest of the document, which is 500.3 about waivers, which again references the Tower Grove East Subcommittee recommend waiver of any provisions of these standards only by written recommendation to the Preservation Board. Each waiver for a specific purpose. The recommendation for a waiver may be made in writing. The Preservation Board on one occasion is effective only in that instance and only for the purpose stated. A recommendation for a waiver once given is not to be considered as a recommendation for a waiver on any future occasion. That again is, that whole section 500.3 is also
It's all coming out.
stricken
Okay.
from the final version of the board bill.
Okay.
Okay. Now that I think we understand what the
I think I see, I see.
He said they couldn't hear on the mic.
Okay, I believe we understand what the amendments are now. Why don't we, why don't we go through the board bill and see if there's any questions, and then we can come back and get it in its proper form. Alderman Boyd, do you have any questions or comments on the board?
Questions, thank you.
Alderwoman Davis?
I did, and I lost my place. Hold on 1 second. Here it is. I just wanted to ask you if this is the correct way to say this, because I'm not sure. On page 18, and I'll start at line 9. And so it says the historic slope of a yard shed shall not be altered at the public facade unless it has at some time been altered and been restored to original configuration. So that's where we're again talking about the sidewalks or any other ornate type things that would be considered a facade to be dealt with.
Well, again, the first point to be made about this is this ordinance only deals with when there's new construction or in addition to an existing building. So all current property owners can make changes to their yards or to their properties as long as they're not expanding the floor area of the building or not building a new building, and these standards don't affect those alterations to existing buildings. As for the site requirements here, the way our neighborhoods, typically the way city neighborhoods in St. Louis were developed when they were developed was that there was something called a terrace, which is a really fancy word for just a kind of a gentle slope up. I think we've all seen this around the city, a slight slope up from the sidewalk, and then it flattens out, and then the building is, typically set back with a little yard in front. This is stating that if you're going to build a new building or build an addition, you can't alter that slope. You can't change that landscape component of the neighborhood.
Okay.
And that's common in all our city historic districts. I think virtually every historic district ordinance requires that.
Okay, when you say it, it's clear, this is not clear. So I don't, that's why I said, is there another way to simplify this so that the average person, whomever, even if it's 5, 10 years from now, and I'm not stuck on that, it's just that I know that people sometimes take things and interpret it 5 different ways, and maybe if it was a little bit clear, and I don't know, you said original, so.
Well, perhaps what we could do is, most people access these ordinances these days on our website, frankly. That's where they go to look for them.
And then they're in
these
those neighborhood
standards.
meetings fighting and arguing and screaming for all the different interpretations of it.
Yeah, that's how things go.
Yeah.
But it's possible, I think, that we might be able to put some kind of note or something on the website that helps clarify that isn't actually in the ordinance, to make it a little clearer. Because if it's not clear to you, it's probably not clear to the average person
Yeah,
either.
and I've dealt with these.
And it's easy to kind of
Yeah.
get into kind of government speak, and it makes sense to us because we swim in this stuff every day.
Well, that would be helpful.
So that's something we can look at.
That would be helpful. Okay, that was it for me.
Alderman Ogilvy.
Sure, a few questions. Can we just back up a little bit? So, almost the entire area that we're creating this local historic district for is already in a National Register district, or one of 3 different National Register districts?
But no local district, correct?
Right, but no local districts. What is the criteria for where a local district can be established and where it cannot be established?
That's covered in Ordinance 64689, and I regret I don't have the ordinance in front of me. But I do remember from memory that there's 2 sections in the ordinance. One is on creating city landmarks, and one's on creating city historic districts. So the landmark district section says anything is eligible to be a city landmark that is a cultural resource. And I think that general philosophy still applies in the historic district context. And that is, I think the fundamental question is, is the neighborhood a historic resource as a whole? Is there documentation about its history and the worthiness of it? Frankly, it's a little easier when something's already in a National Register district, because we have a National Register nomination that we can already read and refer to. But in terms of this particular ordinance, there wasn't a lot of doubt or concern in my mind as the Director of Cultural Resources whether this area was worthy of becoming a local historic district, and in part because it's already a National Register district and has been through that rigorous process to be designated as such.
And then can one of you hit the high points on what the ordinance prescribes and what it prohibits in terms of new construction?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I guess the way I would put it is in comparison to other city historic districts. So the city has 17 landmark and local historic districts. And each of those districts, unlike a lot of cities in the country, has a separate set of standards, which are based in large measure on sort of the input from the community, how rigorous or not rigorous they want them to be. I would say we range from some ordinances that were written in the 70s that are still in use by our office and are still law, that are very general and non-specific. And they require a lot of interpretation by staff. We have other historic districts, Lafayette Square and Soulard come to mind, that are highly prescriptive. I would say this ordinance comes somewhere in the middle. I mean, a big difference between this ordinance and all the others is this ordinance and the standards have no rehabilitation standards. They're only for new construction. That's the concern that the community had that they wanted to address, and we wanted to help them address by creating this. So there are requirements about using materials like, brick is the dominant material in the district. So for example, vinyl siding is not allowed. on a building. Where a building has a large side yard, let's say, there are restrictions on the exterior appearance of that building that faces the side yard, so that you don't get this condition where you have a veneer of brick on the front and then you get, 60 or 70 feet back of a material that's obviously not based on the historic design. The general proportions of the new buildings are designed to fit within the context of the neighborhood. So typically, the neighborhood is 2- and 3-story buildings, often with a side entry door and, say, a window, and then 2 or 3 windows up above. And this is designed to sort of echo that kind of window pattern on a building. It also requires that the percentage of solid to void, the percentage of window opening versus the percentage of solid wall, be relatively similar to what is on the adjacent properties and found typically in the neighborhood. And that's sort of the general standard that's set up in the code. And then, of course, we have the preservation board because there's always going to be oddball situations where what's true 95% of the time can't be true based on either the lot configuration or the way the building needs to be placed on the lot. And then that's where, there's room for some interpretation and there's the chance for public input in public hearings based on decisions.
If I could just add to that, the problems that we were trying to address mainly included prefabricated homes that were all vinyl siding and odd dimensions, and then developers who wanted to have driveways entering and exiting off of streets, like small side streets. And so this is what we came up with to balance the integrity of the neighborhood, but not also be cost prohibitive and not allow people to build and welcome them into the community.
And then this is reviewed by the building division, and Cultural Resources has a staff member who works out of that office, and so they look at it when permits are applied for, correct?
Well, there's 2 ways they get reviewed. The Ordinance 64689, which created the Preservation Board and Cultural Resources, allowed for a review by a preliminary review process and a review by building permit process. So we will have property developers, when they want to build a new building in city historic districts, contact us and say, hey, I'm thinking about building. I've acquired this parcel, I'm thinking about building a building here. And what they do is they can enter into what we call a preliminary review process, where they don't have to create construction drawings and that level of detail. They can create site plans, building elevations, and design details, and then they have the opportunity to apply for a preliminary review through the Preservation Board process. Neighborhoods notified goes to a public hearing, and the board can give them direction before they go to the trouble to do full-blown architectural drawings that the building division might require, say. So that's one way that the process, and that process generally is, we'll have some communication with other city departments, most typically zoning, quite frankly, because if what they're proposing isn't going to pass muster at zoning, we all should know that going in. But that's a process, frankly, that we welcome developers to pursue, because it provides a much more, there aren't time constraints on that, whereas we have to approve or deny a building permit within 45 days of receipt of it. If it's a complicated process, if there's a lot of neighborhood input, and they've already gone to the trouble to make full-blown construction drawings, you get into concerns about unfortunate situations where folks have spent a lot of money on construction drawings, and then we're telling them, here's the 5 ways you don't comply, you need to do new drawings, and then they're spending even more of their money, whereas the preliminary process allows for a much more, a review process that isn't so time sensitive and isn't as challenging necessarily for neighborhood folks to get their input into us, et cetera.
But if a builder applies for a permit that complies with the local historic ordinance, they can go to the building division, and if it complies with 100% of the ordinance, it gets approved at the building division level? There's not a requirement that it go to the preservation board?
If it's in a city historic district, a version of the drawings, a copy of the drawings gets routed to us separately, and then we inform the building division if we can approve it or not. For decades, the policy of the Preservation Board and the Cultural Resources Office is that all new construction projects, buildings built from the ground up, get reviewed by the Preservation Board at a public hearing. So that's not written in ordinance anywhere. That's the way sort of the tradition has evolved, and frankly, I've heard no complaints from members of the Board of Aldermen or neighborhood folks that we do it that way. We don't have to. Theoretically, we could approve something if it just complies with the code, in our opinion. We could approve it and just send it back to the building division, but we do a separate review based on our staff's expertise versus the building division's expertise versus the zoning division's expertise.
Okay. And we're pretty sure the amendments are taking all references to the Tower Grove East, anything, neighborhood association out of this bill?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Alderman Bosley?
I don't have any questions, but I do think this is a pretty interesting process. I think this is one of the first since I've been in office that I can remember seeing someone designate an area, a historic district. So it's definitely a learning process for me, so I can appreciate questions being asked and the effort being made.
Dan, one last thing then. Why don't you, frankly, I forget all this stuff too. Compare for us the local versus the national and the benefits and relative purposes.
Sure. So National Register districts are, the National Register is a federal program from the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service that's been around for decades. And my graduate school professors would be annoyed that I can't remember which decade it started. But basically, the purpose of the National Register designation is to identify historic areas and historic buildings across the country. It's largely an honorary process, but it does have three kind of implications. One is if your building is listed on the National Register, the rehabilitation of the building can qualify for federal historic tax credits, and if there's a program in your state, which we happen to have one, state historic tax credits that can pay up to between 20 and 40%, that can help subsidize between 20 and 40% of the rehabilitation cost of a building. The other way that being on the National Register affects things, if there are federal dollars spent that affect that building, then there has to be a review and a consideration of the effect on historic buildings of that federal expenditure. And then there can be mitigation of that if there's found to be an adverse effect on historic buildings. It can be anything from getting documentation of a building that's going to have to be destroyed, or we had a very creative process with the NGA demolitions where there were oral histories taken from folks in the neighborhood and a website was created. I thought that was a really wonderful project. So 106 documentation, as we call it, is important. And then the final way National Register designation affects things is we have the Ordinance 64832 here in the city that is our Preservation Review District ordinance. Most of the city south of Del Mar is designated as Preservation Review Districts. Most of the city north of, I would say, Natural Bridge is designated National Register districts, and then there's a swath of area of wards and neighborhoods from about the city line to about, I don't know, where Crown Candy is, let's say, that are not designated as such districts, as Preservation Review Districts. However, we do have National Register districts along there. Dr. Martin Luther King Drive has a portion that's a National Register district near the Wellston Loop. Old North St. Louis is a National Register district. Any National Register properties in those areas still get reviewed locally by our office about demolition because they're designated on the National Register. of historic places. So that's the implications of a National Register district. A local district, and the main way that gets used, frankly, is the incentive, the tax incentive to rehab properties. So think of that more as a carrot, and frankly, you could argue that the local historic districts are more stick. A set of standards are in place, as you saw here in this ordinance, that would be a requirement put on the owner and the property owner that if they want to make alterations to their building, they have to conform to those standards or get approval from the Preservation Board if there's a question about that, to ensure that the historic character of the building or buildings in a neighborhood are preserved and maintained when changes are made. Because everything is grandfathered in with the local district. So I hope that.
That's the blessing, that they are already grandfathered in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we'd be very popular if as soon as
No,
this was
you wouldn't.
created,
This
a
room
new
would be
district was
full.
created, we went out and told everyone, now you have to
Yeah.
put in new windows or, retuck point your building.
Okay. Well, if that's it, we'll have, why don't we go ahead and begin taking up the amendments? Chair will entertain a motion to take up amendment number 1.
I move that we adopt amendment number 1 to Board Bill 188.
Move that we adopt amendment number 1. It's been seconded by it's moved by the Alderman from the 22nd, seconded by the Alderman from the 3rd. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Kennedy, Alderman Boyd,
Aye.
Alderwoman Davis,
Aye.
Alderman Kotar, Alderman Ogilvy,
Aye.
Alderwoman Boyd, Alderman Bosley,
Aye.
Alderman Oldenburg, Chairman Rhodey.
Aye.
5 aye votes.
Okay, the Chair will recognize a motion for taking up amendment number 2.
I move that amendment number 2 to Board Bill 188 be adopted.
Second.
Previous roll.
Moved and seconded. Request for previous roll. Hearing no objection, we'll consider amendment number 2 is adopted. Amendment number 3.
I move that amendment number 3 to Board Bill 188 be adopted.
Second.
Moved and seconded.
Previous roll.
Request for previous roll. Hearing no objections, we'll consider amendment number 3 is heard and passed. Now, before us, we have Board Bill number 188 as amended. The Chair will entertain a motion.
I move that Board Bill 188 as amended with a due pass recommendation. Pass with a due pass recommendation.
Second.
Previous roll.
Moved and seconded. Request for previous roll. Hearing no objection, we'll consider that as heard, read, and passed out of committee with the due pass recommendation. I believe that concludes today's business. Thank you all for coming, and again, sorry for all the confusion. I'm sorry.
You're supposed to start yours. Yeah.